The late August sun beat down on the dusty windshield of the miller's minivan as it rolled into Ashton, Massachusetts. Sarah Miller, perched between boxes overflowing with books and old photo albums, peered out the window. Ashton was a far cry from their bustling Boston neighborhood. Quaint clapboard houses lined streets, shaded by ancient maples, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the city's exhaust fumes. "Almost there," her father announced, his voice tinged with a weariness that mirrored her own. The house, when they finally reached it, was a grand, if slightly dilapidated, Victorian. 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and a turret that seemed to pierce the sky, it loomed over the other houses on the street. It had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, Nana Rose, who had passed away just a few weeks prior. A wave of sadness washed over Sarah as she gazed at the house, a bittersweet reminder of her loss. While a part of her felt excited about the change and the new beginning, the old house also instilled a sense of foreboding, a feeling that they were stepping into a place untouched by time, holding secrets within its weathered walls. Stepping inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old wood. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the heavy drapes that hung over the tall arched windows, casting the interior in a perpetual twilight. The entry hall was dominated by a grand staircase that curved upwards into the shadows of the second floor. Sarah ran her hand along the polished banister, feeling the smooth, cool wood beneath her fingertips. The house was filled with Nana Rose's belongings, antique furniture draped in faded fabrics, shelves lined with well-worn books, and countless framed photographs. In the living room, Sarah found a large, leather-bound photo album. She carefully opened it, revealing faded images of her grandmother as a young woman, laughing and carefree. One photo showed Nana Rose standing on the porch of this very house, a bright smile on her face. A pang of longing hit Sarah. This house held so many memories, not just for her grandmother, but now for her as well. The house creaked and groaned around them, as if settling into their presence, a constant reminder of its age and the stories it held within its walls. The first few days were a blur of unpacking boxes and trying to settle into their new surroundings. Sarah's parents were busy with work and getting Ethan enrolled in the local school, leaving Sarah to explore the house on her own. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in her grandmother's old study, a small book-lined room on the second floor, she heard a faint whisper. It sounded like her name, barely audible, carried on a draft that seemed to come from nowhere. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around the room but saw nothing. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Only silence answered her. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just the old house, settling, or perhaps the wind whistling through a crack in the window. But a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that she wasn't alone. Later that evening, as she lay in bed, she saw a fleeting shadow move across the wall, just at the edge of her vision. When she turned to look, it was gone. She pulled the covers tighter around her, a chill running down her spine despite the warm summer night. The whispers and shadows continued, subtle yet unsettling, planting a seed of unease in Sarah's mind. The subtle occurrences escalated. One night, Sarah awoke to find the room bathed in an eerie moonlight. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed them. Shadows, not just ordinary shadows cast by furniture, but elongated, distorted shapes that danced across the walls. They writhed and twisted, taking on vague human forms, stretching and contorting in a silent, macabre ballet. Fear gripped her, a cold, paralyzing dread that made it hard to breathe. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it was just a nightmare. But when she opened them again, the shadows were still there, moving with an unnatural fluidity. One shadow, taller than the others, seemed to detach itself from the wall and glide towards her bed. Sarah gasped, pulling the covers up to her chin. The shadow hovered there for a moment, its form indistinct, before retreating back to the wall and rejoining the others in their silent dance. She lay there, frozen with terror, until the first rays of dawn crept through the window, finally causing the shadows to recede. The next morning, Sarah tried to tell her parents about what she had seen, but they dismissed her concerns. "It's just your imagination, honey," her mother said, patting her hand. "You're still adjusting to the new house." Her father added, "Old houses make all sorts of noises and cast strange shadows. There's nothing to worry about." Ethan, her younger brother, just rolled his eyes. Feeling dismissed and alone, Sarah retreated to her room, the image of the dancing. Shadows burned into her mind. The fear that had been a small seed had now taken root, growing into a constant gnawing presence. Dismissed by her family, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. If the shadows were real, she needed to understand them. She began researching the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. Her first stop was the Ashton Public Library, a small brick building with ivy climbing its walls. The librarian, a kind, elderly woman named Mrs. Davison, directed her to the local history section. Sarah spent hours poring over old town records, newspaper clippings, and genealogical charts. She discovered that the house had been built in the late 1800s and had been home to several different families over the years. One name in particular kept appearing: the Blackwood family. She found a faded newspaper article from 1923 detailing a tragic event that had occurred in the house. The unsolved murder of a woman named Eliza Blackwood. The article described how she had been found dead in her bedroom, the circumstances surrounding her death shrouded in mystery. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Could this be connected to the shadows she had seen? She checked the town archives and found the original property records. The house had indeed belonged to the Blackwood family for several generations. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that the house's dark past was somehow linked to the present. The library's dusty archives became her refuge, a place where she could piece together the fragments of a story that had been buried for decades. Sarah's obsession with the house's history began to isolate her. She spent most of her time in the library or locked away in her room, poring over old documents and trying to decipher the fragmented story of the Blackwood family. Her parents, concerned about her withdrawn behavior, tried to encourage her to socialize and make friends at school, but Sarah found it difficult to connect with her classmates. They talked about parties, sports, and the latest trends, topics that seemed trivial compared to the chilling mystery that consumed her. The shadows, sensing her growing fear and isolation, became bolder. They no longer confined themselves to the night. Sarah would catch glimpses of them during the day, flickering at the edges of her vision, darting across hallways when she turned her back. They even began interacting with objects, causing books to fall from shelves, doors to creak, open and lights to flicker erratically. One afternoon, while she was in the kitchen, a knife flew off the counter, landing just inches from her foot. The incident shook her to her core. She tried to explain these occurrences to her family, but they remained skeptical. Her mother suggested she was stressed from the move and needed to relax. Her father, ever the pragmatist, attributed the events to faulty wiring and drafts. Even Ethan, who usually enjoyed a good ghost story, dismissed her claims as overactive imagination. Feeling increasingly alone and misunderstood, Sarah retreated further into herself, the weight of the house's secrets pressing down on her. The house was becoming a prison, and the shadows, her silent jailers. As Sarah delved deeper into the Blackwood family history, she began to feel a strange connection to Eliza. She learned that Eliza had been a young woman, married to a man named Thomas, who was known for his volatile temper. The newspaper articles hinted at marital discord and financial troubles within the family. Sarah found herself drawn to Eliza's story, feeling a sense of empathy for the young woman who had met such a tragic end within the walls of her own home. During her research, Sarah discovered a hidden compartment in an old desk in the study. Inside, she found a small leather-bound diary. The diary belonged to Eliza Blackwood. As Sarah carefully turned the fragile pages, she began to read Eliza's own account of her life, her hopes, her fears, and her growing dread of her husband. Eliza's entries painted a picture of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, enduring emotional and, Sarah suspected, physical abuse. The final entries, written just days before her death, spoke of a growing fear for her life. Reading Eliza's words, Sarah felt a profound sadness and a chilling sense of recognition. She began to have vivid dreams, almost like visions of scenes from Eliza's life, arguments with Thomas, moments of fear and despair, and finally, a terrifying glimpse of the night of her murder. These dreams felt so real, so visceral, that Sarah began to feel as if she was experiencing Eliza's trauma firsthand. A connection had formed, a bridge across time, linking Sarah to the tragic spirit that haunted the house. One stormy night, the house was battered by wind and rain. The power flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah, huddled in her bed, heard the familiar whispers, but they were louder now, more insistent. Suddenly the shadows appeared, no longer fleeting glimpses, but distinct, human-like. Forms dancing wildly across the walls, illuminated by the flashes of lightning outside. They moved with a frenzied energy, their shapes contorting into grotesque figures. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and Sarah could feel a cold presence in the air. One of the shadows, larger and more defined than the others, detached itself from the wall and moved towards her. As it drew closer, Sarah could make out details, a tall, male figure, its face obscured by shadow, but its posture radiating anger and menace. The other shadows swirled around it, as if in a macabre dance of celebration. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed through the house. A large mirror in Sarah's room, one that had hung on the wall since Eliza Blackwood's time, shattered into 1,000 pieces. In the reflection of the remaining shards, Sarah saw a fleeting image, a woman cowering in fear, her eyes wide with terror, just before a dark figure raised his hand. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the message was clear. This was a memory, a fragment of the night Eliza was murdered. The male shadow in front of her seemed to solidify, becoming more distinct, and Sarah felt a wave of pure terror wash over her. This was not just a shadow, it was a manifestation of the trauma, the anger, and the unresolved pain that haunted the house. The air crackled with energy, and Sarah knew that she was facing the source of the haunting, the echo of a terrible act that had taken place within these very walls. As the male shadow loomed over her, Sarah felt a sudden shift, not of fear, but of understanding. The chaotic energy in the room seemed to coalesce, focusing on her. It was as if the house itself was trying to communicate, to show her the truth. The fragmented images she had seen in her dreams and in the shattered mirror coalesced into a clear, horrifying vision. She saw Eliza, young and beautiful, arguing with her husband Thomas. His face was contorted with rage, his eyes filled with a dark fury. The argument escalated quickly, his words turning into shouts, his hands clenching into fists. Sarah watched in horror as Thomas grabbed Eliza, his grip tightening on her arm. She tried to pull away, but he was too strong. In a flash of terrible clarity, Sarah saw Thomas raise his hand, a heavy candlestick clutched in his fist. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Sarah breathless and shaken. The male shadow before her seemed to waver, its menacing posture softening slightly. Sarah realized that this wasn't a malevolent spirit seeking to harm her. It was a manifestation of Eliza's final moments, a replay of the trauma she had endured. The shadow wasn't Thomas himself, but the echo of his violent act, forever imprinted on the house. The other shadows, the dancing figures, were not separate entities, but fragments of Eliza's fear and anguish, forever trapped in a loop of terror. The revelation was both terrifying and heartbreaking. Sarah understood now. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost seeking revenge. It was haunted by a memory, a wound that refused to heal. The air in the room felt heavy with Eliza's pain, her fear, her desperate plea for justice. Understanding Eliza's plight, Sarah felt a surge of compassion. The fear that had gripped her moments before gave way to a sense of purpose. She knew she had to help Eliza find peace. Looking at the wavering shadow, she spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "Eliza," she said, "I know what happened to you. I know what he did." The shadow seemed to react to her words, its form becoming slightly more defined. Sarah continued, "You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're not alone." She thought of the diary, Eliza's own words, her own story buried for so long. "Your story deserves to be told," Sarah whispered. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room. Even though the windows were closed, the shadows began to flicker and fade, their frantic dance slowing to a gentle sway. The male shadow, the echo of Thomas's violence, began to dissipate, dissolving into the darkness. As the last vestiges of the shadows disappeared, a sense of calm settled over the room. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the house for so long lifted, replaced by a quiet stillness. Sarah felt a sense of closure, not just for Eliza, but for herself as well. By acknowledging Eliza's pain and giving voice to her story, she had helped to break the cycle of fear and trauma that had haunted the house for so many years. The storm outside had passed, and the first rays of dawn streamed through the now clear window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The shattered mirror lay on the floor, a stark reminder of the night's events, but the oppressive feeling that had clung to the room was gone. Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since moving into the house. The following days were filled with a sense of normalcy. The house felt lighter, the air cleaner. The creaks and groans were still there, reminders of the house's age, but they no longer carried a sense of dread. Sarah began to settle into her new life in Ashton. She started making friends at school, joining the photography club, and exploring the small town with her new companions. Her family noticed the change in her, the return of her bright smile and her easy laughter. They were relieved to see her finally adjusting to their new home. The house, once a source of fear and isolation, now felt like a true home. It still held memories, both happy and sad, but the darkness had lifted. Sarah knew that Eliza's story would always be a part of the house's history, but it was no longer a source of terror. It was a reminder of resilience, of the power of empathy, and of the importance of giving voice to the silenced. The house in Ashton, once a place of dancing shadows, had become a place of quiet remembrance, a place where Sarah and her family could finally begin their new life.